This is a new series I'm going to start. Basically, it is the entire history of Starcraft 2 broken up into parts because there's no one that could go through the entire thing in one video. That's impossible. And the reason I decided to do this is because I'm self-indulgent. I think it's an interesting topic, an important one, and one that no one's ever done, and feel like I'm the one to do it. So this will go over mostly the competitive side of StarCraft 2. So the players, the teams, the styles of the players, and how all of that matched up in the tournaments. But it'll also go over the feel, the recollection of the scene at the time, or at least how I saw it. So it's not an objective history, it's a subjective one from my point of view. So I'm probably going to skip over players that I don't think are of any particular value or interest to me. But I'll go more in depth on the more important players, or more interesting players, or players you might be surprised by. So let's get this started, right? The first part you need to know about StarCraft 2 history starts before the game begins, and that's the Blizzard versus OGN scenario where they fought over the IP rights of Brood War. And this is an important part of StarCraft 2's history because of that entire situation. Basically, it got drawn out. Blizzard had to go to GOM TV and had to have them cast the StarCraft 2 tournaments in Korea. And so you created this scenario where OGN wasn't going to touch it, and so you didn't have a TV broadcast appeal compared to other esports. Like this is where League of Legends eventually comes into play because of that in Korea. Though that's only just part of it. On top of that, you don't have the KESPA professional teams joining in, so you have it's more of a wild west kind of scenario in Korea because of the way the Korean teams are structured. All the top teams are very professional, but the small teams and the mid-tier teams, they don't exist in Korea, not really. And so that's where a vacuum is created, and a bunch of teams or even just clubs of players decide to try to fill that vacuum. And finally, because of the entire scenario, it kind of soured the mouths of the Koreans to the StarCraft 2 release. And so that's part of the reason you could point to as to why StarCraft 2 never gained large appeal into Korea. I think a bigger reason is the fact that they never understood the PC bang scenario, where, at least in America, I'm not sure how it was in Korea, but in America, in order to play StarCraft 2, you'd have to download the Blizzard client, and then you'd have to pay for the game, and then you'd play. Whereas in Brood War, you had the cloning thing, so it was much cheaper and easier to install, and everybody could play. On top of that, they had better UMS maps, so that's also a thing. So it just never grasped the hearts of any PC bang players in Korea, and if you don't get that, you don't get anywhere in Korea. So this is sort of an important way of setting up the stage, where even though Korea is the best nation at StarCraft 2, it isn't comparable to League of Legends or Brood War or even Overwatch. I think there is much less interest in the casual side of Koreans players in StarCraft 2 than compared to those games. Even then, though, they still had a pretty crazy talent pool of players to draw from, so take that for what you will. Right. The first tournament is, I'm not sure if this was beta, but it was IEM Cologne, and this is the one that Mara wins over Idra. I don't remember any of the games being particularly interesting, but the story of how Mara won the finals is pretty funny. So basically, he played Demaga in the semifinals of that tournament, and Demaga and Mara were both Brood War bros in a way. Because actually, all three of them were. Because all three of them were foreigners who had kind of been obsessed with Brood War, playing Brood War, trying to get better at Brood War all the time, even though there was really no support for any kind of Brood War foreigner competition. Not in the way we think of esports today, anyway. So after Maro played Demaga in the semifinals and beat him, Demaga went up to Maro and was like, okay, there's this amazing build you have to use. It's like, well, I was like, oh, what is it? And then he gave him the 3 Racks Reaper. And it's different from the 3-Rack Reaper that BN uses. It's different from the modern era 3-Rack Reaper for a few reasons. Like, obviously, there was no regen back then. On the other hand, though, you had 40 damage grenades against buildings. And nobody had really built up a way to counter it just because of, well, obviously it's really early in the fucking game, but queens have 3 range, so I mean, give 3 I don't care who you are, give 3 range to any player in the modern era. They're not going to be able to hold the 3-Rack Reaper from back then, right? And then on top of that, the maps were terrible. The distances were way shorter than they are now. So basically, Morrow just killed Idra, and Demaga ended up winning that tournament by proxy because he got that thing nerfed, just as he planned. And then after that, you have 2 tournaments that coincided in similar time frames. The first I'll talk about, because it's shorter, is MLG Raleigh. And MLG Raleigh is the tournament that is the debut of Huck as the top 400 Protoss. I remember the finals being pretty good between Huck and Kiwikaki, but basically I think Huck as a player was just way more effective in what he was trying to do, and Kiwikaki spent too much time trying to be cute. That's my takeaway from it, of that particular series and just their careers as a whole. And Huck comes more into play into the grander stage of StarCraft 2 later on, especially once he moves over to Korea. And he's definitely one of the most important foreigners to have ever touched the game. And even now, he's a figure in esports. Specifically, he's the manager of the Overwatch team for Boston called the Boston Uprising, if you're interested in that. The first tournament and the most famous story to come out of the tournament is GSL Season 1 and FruitDealer. And it's a thematically interesting tournament because it's an open tournament and there was a gigantic fucking prize pool. So it basically drew a bunch of players who either were retired, like StarCraft 1 Brood War players who thought, may as well do it for one last shot, or a bunch of younger guys who were kind of interested in playing StarCraft 2 competitively. And this was the only game. This was like the biggest game in town. I think there were still online tournaments and stuff too, but this is the one you wanted to win. And this is the start of the origin story of GSL as, in my opinion, the most important StarCraft 2 tournament series to exist, because it's the one that crowns the best players in the world. It's the one that gives continuity, gives legacy, gives history to the entire StarCraft 2 scene in a way that no other StarCraft 2 tournament can match. That's how I see it. So in that tournament, FruitDealer he represented something different. And what I mean by that was FruitDealer as a player had been a failed Brood War pro. He was a player who he got his ID because he became a fruit dealer. He sold fruit on the street. And then when StarCraft 2 came out, he decided to try this one more time. And as far as I know, his most famous game in Brood War was playing against Boxer, but Boxer was washed up by then, so it wasn't particularly impressive in any way. And so FruitDealer was a Zerg player, and this is another important part of the story and another important part of how people kind of thought about StarCraft 2 moving forward. Was Zerg was kind of a shit race to begin with, even though they're like, I guess in the beta they were kind of abusive, to be honest, just because I remember the roaches had way too much, were like one supply and had way too much fucking armor, so you could legitimately call a roach into more roaches macro builds, and you wouldn't be wrong, even though it was disgusting. So FruitDealer represented, but when FruitDealer was playing that GSL, Zerg was fairly weak. Nobody had figured it out because it wasn't really an intuitive race in the same way that Terran or Protoss might have been, just because there were no easy ways to get easy wins. In the beginning days, it's much easier to use cheesy builds just because there's way less information. You have to acquire way less information. You have to frontier and just cheese the shit out of people. And for Zerg at least, they hadn't figured out how to use the larva mechanic, and they hadn't figured out how to like do like 1 or 2 base roach rushes, or 1 or 2 base Zergling Baneling rushes quite yet. So a bunch of them fell down, a bunch of them died, and he kind of became the last sole surviving Zerg player in that entire tournament. He beat Guinea Pig in his first match, and Guinea Pig's kind of a funny player, but I won't get into it too much. Just suffice to say, he was the one who created Voidway Colossus, which was another disgusting composition. For some reason, I find a bunch of the compositions in StarCraft 2 to be kind of disgusting. So, the second player he played was Tasia, and this is Tasia's first tournament, obviously. It's the Verse tournament, and he beats Tasia pretty soundly. And then from there, he beats Top, who was a macro Terran, I'd suppose. For OGS called Old Generations, and he was favored to win that matchup. In fact, he should have won that matchup, except Top did this thing where he on the final map of that game, he maxed out Thors, and he thought, oh, this will surely win because I've maxed out Thors. And then what happened was he moved his entire army into this very small circle where FruitDealer was like, wow, okay. And then he surrounded it with ultras, killed it instantly, and then won the game. And it was kind of like a miracle. It was a miracle move, but it was like, Jesus Christ, Top, you were so bad. He would continue to be so bad, but he did have some good things about Top. Had some good things about him, but actually Top. I'll go into Top right now, actually, because he's a player who will represent something important about the style and state of StarCraft 2 as a game. But basically, Top was a heavily focused macro player. And what I mean by heavily focused on macro was he was much more interested in building up an economy, in building up infrastructure, building up units, but he had almost no control over his own units. He just kind of threw them out there and felt it stuck in like a large ball. And this, I'll come back to this later when this style goes up against other players in the heyday of his career, so to speak. But basically, Top kind of proves that that kind of style, even though it worked in Brood War, it was never going to work in StarCraft 2. You needed to have some level of control over your army just because of how hard the counters were and the way the UI works. Because obviously in Brood War, it doesn't really matter. It didn't quite matter as much because you can be out microed, but if you just made a shitload more, it'd be harder to out micro everything just because you can only control 12 units at a time, and no amount of APN could like make the difference if you were super outnumbered, so to speak. Whereas in StarCraft 2, that's a very different story because you can put all the army on just one hotkey, right? So he beats Top, and that's considered a miracle run, and it was because FruitDealer had played a shitload of bad maps. Actually, this is another reason as to why Zerg was considered a shit race, is because all the maps were fucking terrible for Zerg back then. Actually, let me go check. It was absolutely horrendous from what I remember. Let's see here. Yeah, Blistering Sands, that wouldn't even... That would actually be rejected in any Team Liquid like map contest right now. Desert Oasis, same thing. Scrap Station was okay, but like in terms of short air distance, it was pretty bad for anybody who could figure out how to use that air distance. Steps of War is a literal phone booth. There are actually, I'm certain there are actually maps today and maps in the last few years that have had a larger base than the entirety of Steps of War. Zelnaga Caverns was actually a decent map for the time, but Gigantic Open Natural, which was fine for Zerg to an extent, much worse for Protoss. Kulas Ravine, this is the map that FruitDealer played Top on in that game I talked about, where Top maxed out on Thors, moved them all into a specific area, then got surrounded and killed. That was disgusting, but basically this map had a bunch of like very weird architectural points to it where if you had a Reaper, you could just like jump up onto the cliff and then just shoot down onto like the mining drones without fear of any hit back until like an Overlord came over and then a Spinecrawler came over. You couldn't even use the Queen just because the Queen had shit range, so it didn't really matter as much. And then on top of that, I think the main actually wasn't on put on high ground. You know how in modern StarCraft 2 is like there's a high ground and there's a ramp and then there's natural. In Kulas Ravine it was just one plane, so it was pretty so there was no real defender's advantage if you got the natural and then went up the main, because the vision was equal. Lost Temple, this is like a classic Brood War map. It was decent, unless you got close proxy position spawns, and in that case you're in the Steps of War scenario all over again. On the other hand, I guess if you actually got by close air spawns, that would kind of fuck you up if you were a Terran versus Zerg, just because once the Mulas came out, they had you could never leave your base without getting threatened to like have the Zerg destroy everything or destroy so much that you lost the game. Metalopolis, another good map relative to the time, probably the best map of the time, but also a map where if you got close proxy positions, it was even smaller than a phone booth. Like that was the shortest spawn distance of any map back then. And then Delta Quadrant, my god, that was disgusting. That was another disgusting map where basically you had like an in-base natural but it was blocked by rocks, and then you had an outside natural, but there was like a 270-degree openness to it, and then you could get fucked. Any aggressive attack would kind of like destroy you, and there was also surprisingly short walk distance. So that was another bad map. Yeah, maps were not good back then. Right. So back to FruitDealer. He was able to beat top, and then Inca was his next opponent, and Inca became kind of famous for later on for Dark Templars, but back then he was a bit more standard, and by standard I mean cheesy. Basically a bunch of cannon rushes, a bunch of aggressions, and then he got wiped out. He was also like a teammate of Top's, so basically you have FruitDealer beating up on the OGS guys. And actually, I remember there's some kind of beef between FruitDealer and the OGS guys, just because he was originally part of the team but then left for TSL. But it's not that interesting. And in the finals, he meets Rainbow, and Rainbow was another ex Brood War player but he was much more successful than FruitDealer. They play off in the finals, and the FruitDealer like pulls the miracle, so to speak, just because he is Zerg. But in all honesty, he actually understood the game much better than Rainbow did, and the way FruitDealer played was if he got into the macro game, what would happen was he would use Zerg. He'd use like a strange combination of Zerg Roach, Zergling Roach, like Banelings into Ultras, or like even Overlord drop Banes, which was a unique idea that didn't really see revival until a long time after in LOTV, just because it was it was very unviable before LOTV came out. I'll put it that way. And he's also a player who like did ultra drops. He used mutas pretty well, but he also had the capability of cheesing the shit out of people. So he was surprisingly versatile and surprisingly knowledgeable, just because like the game had only come out for like a month by then. So yeah, FruitDealer ends up winning that tournament, and it's such an amazing story. It's such an amazing run that like a Blizzard artist basically gave him the only like fan art of any Blizzard artist ever gave to a GSL victor. Like some people still think of him as their favorite player in StarCraft 2 history, despite the fact that he didn't do much soon afterwards. And I think even Hotbin made like a video of him of his like tournament run through that tournament. And then the next tournament is IEM New York, and I'll only talk about the finals for a little bit. It's Phoenix versus QXC. Both of these guys were not particularly successful when we're particularly successful as StarCraft 2 players, but they both had a role to play later down the line. I don't really know much about Phoenix as a player. He seemed like not a lot of information ever came out about him just because he was from a different country, and they moved to Korea, and that didn't really quite work out. I will say that Bedrock QXC was he was a player who had an incredibly high game IQ, I guess. And what I mean by game IQ, actually not really game IQ, it might be better to say he had a very high understanding of StarCraft 2. And in terms of game design, I believe he was like one of the best at understanding the nuts and bolts of how StarCraft 2 worked on a micro level, and how that micro level affected the entire macro level of the game. So he was a pretty smart guy, but he was also a player who could never really find his form throughout all of StarCraft 2. Could never find a consistent way to be good, and eventually, like, he moved on, became a very successful board game designer. So there you go. We'll come back to QXC a bit later when he shows up again. So GSL Season 2 is the next big tournament, and this also coincides with MLG Washington. Actually, I'll do MLG Washington first. So this one's pretty quick. Basically, it just got onto a plane because he was playing in Korea at the time in GSL. And he got off the plane, and then somebody told him, "Oh, did you realize Patch Notes came out?" What the fuck? Patch Notes came out when he was on the plane. Couldn't practice, still won the entire thing. Still beat up Select, who was a Dawn of War champion 3 times over or something. And competitive player within NA, at least, for a decent period of time. Pretty solid, but he never really shined to me, Select. There was nothing particularly special about him, I guess. That's I don't know, just about his play, I mean. But he had a successful career, all things considered. He got money, he played a bunch of tournaments, got okay results. Idra beat him. And now we go back to GSL Season 2. And this is the season because well, actually, let's go back to GSL Season 1 because I did forget a few other things. Basically, a bunch of the big players are introduced on Season 1 that have ramifications down the line. So I named FruitDealer, I named Tasia. Inca was another one. Live Forever, I'm only going to mention him just because he instantly died right after the GSL. I always thought that was funny. So other players were Polt, MC. This is the GSL Season 1's debut of Maru versus Sela, and it's actually exactly what you would expect from a Maru game, where he beats the shit out of Sela with his micro and his control of his units. And San comes out. San, the Protoss player, comes out. This is his first tournament as well. Lucira, pretty successful Zerg player in Korea. That's his first tournament, and I believe he loses to TLO in the first match, and kind of like got pissed at that because TLO had used this really funny, well thought out, rather than funny, but he's this really well thought out mech play against Lucira on Zelnaga Caverns, and basically Lucira had no idea how to deal with it, and then he lost. And then the 2 final players you have to look out that came out in Season 1 was Genius. And Genius was hyped up to be the best player in the StarCraft 2 beta, but he hilariously got cheesed out by a guy named David, and everybody else cheered that day. And then the final player was Bian, who was a Protoss player, didn't do much, but just an interesting note. That's like his first tournament, and he crashed out. So go back to Season 2. In Season 2, Nestea had watched FruitDealer's Miracle Run. He had watched FruitDealer win, and FruitDealer was a friend of his. And then this convinced Nestea that even though he was like nearing the age of 30, even though he had basically failed as a Brood War Pro to be competitive in any sense, he was just a 2v2 player. Beyond that, he hadn't really done anything. he believed that, you know what, maybe I can just give this one last try. His family and his friends are like, no, what the fuck are you doing? This is a terrible idea. Like, you know how washed up you are. He really was washed up. And he decides, no, fuck it, I'm going to do it. And then he spends a good amount of time between season 1 and 2 playing the game, studying the game, because in season 1, like, he played, I forget if he played in the opening rounds or he played in the qualifier, but he didn't even know what a creep tumor was. Like, you can tell he didn't know what a creep tumor was because he like, I remember there's like a situation where he could have solved like one of the problems if he just put down a creep tumor, but he didn't. So pretty clear he didn't know what it was. Season 2, though, he had leveled up his understanding of the game immensely. He was a much more solid player, and he wasn't nearly as flashy as FruitDealer. But the understandings and the underpinnings of the game, he was much better at. And what I mean by that is he would get information, and then he would counter that information. And he did this a bunch of times throughout his run in GSL. So even though it wasn't flashy, it was in a way more impressive than FruitDealer because it didn't rely on a bunch of like miracle shit happening along the way. And he eventually plays MarineKing. And MarineKing's an interesting. Actually, before MarineKing plays, I believe he plays Boxer. And Boxer was obviously the famous Lim Yo-hwan from Brood War, one of the all-time great players of that game, and the most popular player of Brood War in Korea, even though I don't think he's the greatest, even close to it, but that's like the title a lot of people give him just because of his fame. And the other famous player to have come out from Brood War to play in this GSL was Nada, and Boxer versus Nada was like what happened in that GSL was like one of the most hype matches. Didn't really live up to the hype, I thought. As for Nada himself, he ended up playing Lenok, and this is Lenok's first tournament, and Lenok had won like 1 or 2 rounds before running into Nada. And I should mention, in GSL Season 1, GSL Season 2, they were 64-man tournaments, so that's why you get longer runs in those tournaments than afterwards. So Nada plays Lenok, and I remember this is like this particular match like represents Lenok so well. Basically, what happens is Lenok 6 pools Nada. This is like a 13 or 14. This guy's like 13 or 14 years old. He's like, fuck it, I am going to 6 pool one of the all-time great champions of Brood War. Beats Nada, and Nada's like, fine. Takes off his jacket and then starts, and then they start playing for real. And then they play 2 macro games, and Nada uses this interesting sort of mech into bio play that he never used again and is never seen again until you get into like TY and Fantasy in like 2014 to 2015, that sort of period. And Nada beats him, but like what's surprising about this is that even though Lenok cheesed the shit out of Nada in the first game, his macro game was legit. He seemed to know a pretty decent amount of how to build up a game, how to get the units, and how to like use those units specifically. He had a lot of control, and you could tell like this guy was going to be something one day, or he certainly had much better potential than a bunch of the other players I hadn't seen at that point. And so you get into the final player of the tournament that's I consider very important. It's MarineKing. And MarineKing, back then he was known as Boxer. And then what happened was the real Boxer, like he qualified as Boxer, but then the real Boxer decided to play. And so he called himself Foxer for a bit, which is like fake Boxer, before finally settling on MarineKing. And the reason he settled on MarineKing was before he made that name switch, he played against Kirix in I believe it was the semifinals, but it might have been the quarterfinals of Season 2. Let me check real quick. But basically, that's one of the most important games in StarCraft 2 history, or most important series in StarCraft 2 history, if we're just talking about it from a meta perspective, because that's the match where MarineKing unveils his control. Yeah, it's the quarterfinals. Yeah, so that's the match where MarineKing shows that the best way to play against a Zergling Baneling composition is to use Marines and then to control each of the individual Marines and split them apart, and sort of just like kite and drag the Zergling and Banelings. So even if the Zergling and Banelings hit you, when the Banelings explode, none of the AoE damage just kills all of the Marines. And this was like mind blowing to everybody at the time because nobody had ever really thought about doing it that way, and it was a crazy match because on the other side of the equation was Kyrix, and Kyrix, even though his contributions to the stylistic tendencies of Zerg players is underlooked, he also did something incredibly important in this tournament, and this was the Zergling Baneling like non-stop aggression that he exhibited against MarineKing, where the two of them would go on 2 base and then they just fight each other out and try to win off of control. And this is the first time where you see how important control really is, or can be, and to what extent it can be in the StarCraft 2 meta. So between the two of them, they put on this like killer series, and MarineKing eventually wins out the event, and MarineKing moves on to the finals against Nestea. I will say for Kyrix, even though that was like a really great series by him, he was not that great of a player, and even though I think he ended up winning a tournament, a smaller one soon after, in the grand scheme of things, he wasn't really a relevant player. Right, so MarineKing versus Nestea. This is the finals that kind of defines, for me at least, MarineKing as a player. Or at least defines his weaknesses as a player. That's the best way to say it. And so when it came to Nestea versus MarineKing, everybody thought MarineKing was favored to win this one. And there are a bunch of legitimate reasons why. First off, Zerg was still pretty weak. Obviously, still 3-range queens. Obviously, the maps were still shit. Obviously, MarineKing had exhibited a style that nobody had seen, and that should have favored MarineKing immensely if they got into a macro game. On top of that, if MarineKing actually did decide to cheese in that game, the likelihood of that succeeding would be very high just because of how short the rush distances are. And nobody was really impressed by Nestea's run, even though it was very solid. It hadn't really shown any of the sparks, any of that miracle shit that FruitDealer had. So everybody had MarineKing pegged to win. What actually happened, though, was basically MarineKing's like, fuck you, I'm going to do 2 racks all in every game. And he eventually lost 3-4. And the reason I believe this is like emblematic of MarineKing's weaknesses is because first off, he didn't understand his own strengths as a player. Like, there was no reason to go for the 1 base all in when he could have just gone 2 bases and then done that same style against Kyrix. He used against Kyrix against Nestea. I think that would have been a much more effective tactic overall, but MarineKing, for whatever reason, he decided to go 1 base all in. And then on top of that, it's not even like it's that bad of a plan considering how bad the maps are, but he fucked it up. And what I mean by that is Game 7, he got the best proxy positions possible on Metalopolis. Like I said, there are certain maps that have been created in the map pool since that are like 3 or 4 times the rush distance of the rush distance between close spawn positions on Metalopolis. And then MarineKing even made it closer because he proxied both racks below the ramp. So it was even closer than that. And we're running into Nestea, who has queens with 3 range. But Nestea was able to... obviously, this is Game 7, so Nestea's like, obviously, this guy's going to fucking cheese me. Like, he's done it every fucking game. So he kind of prepared an ambush for MarineKing, where, like, if he had on like, top of his ramp with, like, drones, Zerglings, and queen, and, like, a queen there. And the premise of it was that if MarineKing actually went up, he would die. And then MarineKing went up and then he died. And then Nestea eventually won that game. And the reason I consider it emblematic is because it kind of shows like MarineKing doesn't understand his strengths. He doesn't really understand Starcraft in the overall sense. He understands it in his own strengths and what he wants to do, what he likes to do, but he never understood the game of Starcraft. Whereas Nestea very, very much did. And also this kind of exhibits like a bit of the choke that MarineKing had throughout his career. But I'll be honest, I don't actually think that was a choke. I actually think that's just who MarineKing was as a player. He wasn't smart enough to figure out how to create a plan to beat Nestea. whereas Nestea was. Moving on, let's see here. There was BlizzCon, which Genius won. That's not very interesting of itself, because it was done in like a WCG format, whereas like three reps from each region show up, and wasn't that good of games. Loner was a bit hyped for a bit. He was like the guy who ended up playing Genius, but Loner wasn't that good in the overall scheme of things, and he wasn't that interesting as a player. MLG Dallas is the tournament that has Jinro rise as the best foreigner Terran for the early parts of Starcraft 2. And it's also the one where it was an important tournament for Jinro specifically, because it's the one that kind of gives him confidence, because he was playing in Korea the entire time, but as a player, I don't know if he actually believed he could make it. Like, there was an interview years later where he basically said like when he made the semifinals, he was kind of just satisfied. Like, he didn't really believe he already believed he had overachieved and gone way farther than he should have, in a sense, and he didn't have a killer mentality to believe he could beat the players he ended up playing against, because he respected them a lot. He didn't think he thought they were better than he was. So he's like, oh, I guess this is as far as I go, and he didn't really have that killer mentality. So I feel like this MLG Dallas was kind of an important victory for him, because it proved to him at least that he could be one of the better players, and he ended up proving it in the following GSL. And this is the third GSL in 2010, and this is within a span of like 3 months. So back then, like, the fucking schedule was crazy. And I will say that this is a side tangent, but it's not. I'm not sure where this idea comes from, but a lot of people believe that it's easier to win a bunch of tournaments in a row, relative to like an extended tournament where you have time to prepare for your opponents. But I actually don't think that's necessarily the case. Like, there's an argument to be made here that because of the rigor, because of the schedule, because of how fast the game evolves, and because of how you're stacking up tournament upon tournament upon tournament, the fatigue, the wear and tear, the fact that you can't study every opponent, all this shit comes into play. And in a sense, it could be argued that it's even harder to win multiple tournaments in a row like that than it is to win one tournament where you have plenty of time to prepare for each opponent. Obviously there's like pros and cons to both sides of the argument, but I don't think it's easily one way or easily the other way. And it's not like people were giving out free fucking tournaments here. So, yeah, there's that. Now we go into GSL Season 3 Open, and this is the final Open. This is like this is the one before they introduced like the Code S, Code A scheme into the GSL. And let's see here. I believe this is the first one where the name MVP starts ringing into people's ears, because MVP was also a Brood War player, but among all of the like transferees, he's arguably the most successful one up to that point. He had gone pretty deep in the OSL once, and so people were pretty hyped about him, and they believed that he was going to be the one, and he's going to be the one. But obviously, he didn't really have time to. He didn't really have time to like learn the game as much, but in terms of practice, a bunch of people were saying he was really fucking good, especially on the ladder. And he didn't really get far in this tournament, though he did beat Idra. I think he got cheesed out by Choya in the end. And this was also the tournament that had the rise of bit by bit as a player, where he kind of like cheesed the fuck out of a bunch of like one or two players. But because the cheese was so ridiculous and so badly executed, that his very existence kind of like mocked Starcraft 2 in a way. So that's why he's both revered and hated, because like they're like, oh man, Starcraft 2 is such an important tactical game. And then there was bit by bit who was like pulling SCVs, pulling Marines, and not even microing them well and still winning. It's like, come on, man, it was pretty funny. But he basically proved he kind of proved a point in a sense that like at least the game was not very well evolved. That's kind of the point. Other players to show up during this time this is like Squirtle's first tournament, and he becomes an important player later on. This is Gumiho's first tournament. He made it, qualified as a random player. This was also Jelizerg's first tournament, where Jelizerg had also transferred over from Brood War and had started playing. And Jelizerg is one of the few guys who actually like seems to really enjoy StarCraft 2, even though like none of his skill set really fits that game. Not really. And then he ends up playing and losing against MC. And it's kind of like a foreshadowing of what would eventually happen when they met in the GSL finals a little later on. As for MC had been another hype player in the GSL Opens, but he had never really done it. And this is sort of the reason why, because before MC was a StarCraft 2 player, he was a Brood War player, and he famously went like 0-10 in the like, Pro League, I believe. And back then he was kind of known as the Suicide Toss because he did the famous ceremony where he did this cutthroat thing, right? And then he instantly lost, and so they nicknamed him the Suicide Toss. And as kind of, the point of that is like he kind of like choked under pressure, but through like the GSL seasons, through his time at the Pro League, he kind of got over it. Especially in this season, this is the season where like it all comes together for MC, and MC makes the run all the way to the finals where he beats Rain in one of the most unmemorable finals of the year. As for Rain, Rain actually played a funny quarterfinals against Nestea, where he basically did the same thing MarineKing did, except better, where he just 2-racks the entire time. And the reason this is funny is because some Grandmaster Zerg player in Korea started flaming Nestea on the forums. Nestea's like, it isn't that easy to hold. Are you kidding me? And it's like, no, man. Anybody who could see that coming could hold that. It's like, okay, fine. Let's make a bet then. I will off race as Terran, and I will do an 11-11 racks against you. And if you hold against it, I forget what exact the terms were, but I think Nestea would pay him money or something. But on the other hand, if Nestea won, that guy would quit the forums forever. And then Nestea won like 4-0. It was like a hilarious like side story to that GSL. And so MC plays Rain. MC wins the entire tournament. And MC, like FruitDealer and like Nestea, had a story in and of himself where he was basically from a poor family, and it was like a single home, and basically at some point in his life he found like the landowner was like masturbating to his mom or something. That's from like a video. That's from like a Twitch stream with him and State, I believe, where he talked about it for a little bit. And then like he kind of swore to himself like he would get the fuck out of there. He'd get enough money to get the fuck out of there. And like his stepdad actually racked up a bunch of debt. And so the only thing he was really good at was playing Brood War, but he had to grind a lot. He had to push a lot just to get into a Brood War team, and he eventually made it, and he eventually got like a small stable income. It was like the most he had ever gotten. But when StarCraft 2 came out, he had been given another weird choice, where it's like he finally got the stable income as a Brood War player. But StarCraft 2, the prize pool was so fucking massive, and what people don't realize is if you were like a B teamer or even like a majority of the A teamers, you weren't getting paid a lot as a Brood War player. So he had to make a decision as to what he was going to do, and then MC decided that he was going to roll the dice again and become a StarCraft 2 player. And this pays off as he wins the GSL Season 3 and then buys his parents a house so they can move out. And obviously it kind of like defines his career in a sense, MC's, because this has always been a guy who has chased monetary, like he's a very competitive player, don't get me wrong, but he's always believed in the monetary value of things because he had been in such a rough spot early on in his life. Like he wanted to make sure that could never happen again. So that's sort of MC's like little story and his rise to GSL champion. And then the final tournament that wraps up the year is DreamHack Winter. It's Nama versus Mana finals. Nama was He was okay. Even though he ended up winning that tournament, Mono is a much more interesting player in terms of where he went from that point forward. He was another Brood War player, but he was pretty young, and he was a Protoss player. And the reason I'm pointing out Mono is because the way he played Protoss at that time kind of like foreshadows the eventual change in the Protoss meta, because like Mono was very defensive. He was playing much more like Nestea. Like Huck and MC were playing a very similar style of this aggressive, effective Protoss play that was based around like the understanding of force fields, the understanding of aggression, and how to break open the opponent. And credit to both of them, because I think that was a much more effective style when we retroactively look at it. Whereas Mana's play was more along the lines of like Liquid Hero later on, and then obviously Rain is the big one, but Mana definitely played much more like FruitDealer than he did those two. And so that's an interesting point to make out, because Mana is one of the best foreigners to have ever played StarCraft 2. And he's actually really underrated for what he managed to accomplish. And so we come to the final bits. Those were the first tournaments in the early part of 2010. And the reason I called this the new frontier is because it really was a new frontier for everybody. This StarCraft 2 had come out at either too early or too early or too late, I guess. I don't know. Probably too early just for when we look at it retroactively, but it basically came out at the exact same time that like Justin TV and Twitch started becoming more popular, so it became the go-to game to stream for a little bit. And because of that, it became like a very popular esport, and in a way like resurrected competitive gaming, because of like the crash of CGS and the economic recession kind of like killed it in the West, and StarCraft 2 sort of resurrected it in a way. And so it was kind of new frontiers, especially for a bunch of these Brood War players foreigner Brood War players who had never had that kind of experience, and for a bunch of these players who in Korea like could never make it in Brood War. This was their chance to shine. This was their chance to try something new, and it was also the introduction of a bunch of different and new players. So in a way, it was a new frontier, and it was the beginning of something different, I suppose. All right, that's the end of part 1. I'll see you guys later.